I'm Ewan Aitken and welcome to Faith Without Walls. Tonight we're discussing 21st century spirituality. Although church attendance numbers are falling, there is still evidence that belief is strong. So what does that mean for the church and organised religion? And what alternatives are there to the traditional spiritual paths? Joining me in tonight's discussion are John Lloyd, Scottish Bible Society, Dr. David Weeks, psychologist, the Reverend Lydia Trettis, an interfaith minister and member of the Findhorn Foundation, the Reverend Marion Chatterley, chaplain to Waverley Care, an HIV and AIDS charity, and John Kelso, Humanist Society of Scotland. David, if I can turn to you first. As a psychologist, what do you understand by the concept or the idea of spirituality?
Well, without wishing to make it sound like the X-Files, it's an awareness of dimensions outside the physical and scientific, and an awareness of the supernatural, perhaps, of things that perhaps touch on morals and ethics, but subsume a lot of values and beliefs and faith. Basically having faith in the unknown, and there's a lot of unknown about it, I think.
But isn't that kind of two different things? A kind of morals and ethics, which are a kind of a code, and the unknown and the mysterious of the other.
Well, people try to separate them, I think, in nice little categories. But I think that many people who believe in the supernatural will also have a lot of baggage to do with morality and ethics as well, and vice versa. I mean, the two have emerged almost simultaneously, and I think there's a lot of overlap.
Baggage sounds a kind of pejorative word there.
Well, I'm thinking of it from the point of view of science and not religion, because I think scientists in general view the supernatural and the things they can't really pin down physicalistically, they do view it quite pejoratively. I'm not speaking about myself, but the way I think scientists view this subject. So, various mystical elements, for instance, have always kind of been a bit, sort of from the scientific point of view, always been a bit wishy-washy and, out there, but what is it? Can you touch it? Can you put your fingers on it?
So if it doesn't have hard factual meaning, then it's not relevant. I don't think you would agree with that, Lydia, would you?
Yeah, I guess my take on it, I might be a bit simplistic about it, but for me, spirituality is just that inner yearning to find, where did I come from? Why am I here? Who really loves me? Who do I love?
Is it entirely internal?
No, I'd say it's internal and external as well, but that yearning starts from within.
So what does an organisation like the Findhorn Foundation bring to that? I mean, is it like another church, or is it more open than that?
I would say it's quite a bit more open than that. People who live at the foundation come with no faith, a search for faith, or with a spiritual practice that they're quite dedicated to. For example, we have members of the Church of Scotland who live with us. We have practicing Buddhists. We have people who chant Hindu chants and practice all of the Jewish holidays, and then many things in between.
So how do you find any meaning in that? I mean, it seems to me it's a bit of everything there, and it's kind of off-the-shelf job.
Yeah.
One of them and one of them, please.
For some it is a bit off the shelf. For some, it's quite a dedicated, straight-ahead practice. It depends entirely on the purpose. And the beautiful thing about the Findhorn Foundation is all are welcome there, no matter what the faith.
John, what would your take on that then be? I mean, as a humanist, you would struggle with the word spiritual, and even celebrating anything that was in terms of a kind of religious order?
No, in fact, I rather disagree with David. I think that spirituality is as much about the questions you're asking and the quest you go down in exploring those questions, rather than necessarily to do with the answers you arrive at. So some people will even talk about a secular spirituality. I think the term's a bit disingenuous, but it's maybe a useful working term because...
Sorry, a secular spirituality. What do you mean by that?
Well, obviously, in as much as spirituality is concerned with superstitious ideas of the supernatural, religious ideas, then folk like myself can't subscribe to that. But secular folk ask the same questions. I mean, if you look at the dictionary, the definition of spirituality is extremely broad. It's not just about religious dogma. It's about questions like what's the nature of truth and beauty and love, and the old questions of why are we here, how do we get to be here, what should we do with our lives while we're here, does anything happen to us afterwards? And it seems to me that those are questions and areas that secular folk are interested in, as well as religious folk, and that can be explored in a purely secular way, and where you can find purely secular answers. Lydia was mentioning Buddhism, of course. There's no creator God there. There's an interest in enlightenment and, if you like, spiritual wisdom, and Buddhists would say that you could explore that path whether you be of any religion or none. So it's perhaps quite a good concrete example of that.
John, you work with the Scottish Bible Society, which is a kind of fairly at the heart of an orthodox religion. Where does spirituality fit into that? I mean, can you relate to what John's saying there?
Well, I think we provide the book, essentially.
Right.
So,
this is a discussion, not a sales pitch.
Yes, but I'm actually very concerned about use of words like religion, spirituality. You've used the word. Sorry, I've lost. What word was it you used? Began with S.
Secular spiritual.
No, it was superstition. Sorry.
Yeah.
That actually, once we start bandying words like that about, we're then taking our baggage up, as David has said, it seems to me. And one of the things that I think is very important to note is that there are spiritual values, there are spiritual searches, so there's different uses of the same word. So I'd like perhaps to explore that before I commit myself, in a sense, to your question.
Go ahead in terms of...
Can we ask some questions? Yeah. And firstly, what do we mean by spirituality? Why are we using a word... Why are we using a title 21st century spirituality rather than religion in the 21st century, or even narrowing it down, Christianity in the 21st century? There's something about what is happening now where we are less concerned to take on labels as we might have been in the past. And in fact, it seems to me that the use of the term spirituality is a way of avoiding a lot of issues.
Well, you mean it's kind of a soft word? It kind of covers the bases, and we can all be nice together, and it doesn't actually deal with the real world.
Indeed, that I think is the problem.
It might be that, John, but it might also be that actually for a lot of people, orthodox and organised religion has actually caused an enormous amount of damage. And so the word religion, I think, becomes a barrier and actually is something that turns people away from that which they're seeking. So for me, I don't mind which words we use, actually. I think if spirituality is a word that enables people to engage with that journeying that Lydia was talking about, then I think that's wonderful.
Yes, but it's not interesting that we use those words. That wonderful quote from Lindy Runcie when her husband was made Archbishop Runcie. She said, "Too much religion makes me go pop." And I have to say that's absolutely my position, and I'm a religionist by trade.
It's interesting for somebody who promoting the
yes,
Bible Society.
I agree with you. Religion is the problem, and perhaps we need to get rid of a few of those words and concepts before we can then ask the question about spirituality now, the 21st century. That whole business of, I started by saying we provide the book. You know, what are our points of reference? The Bible is one point of reference. Now, I will argue very strongly that it is an essential point of reference, not the least because of 2,000 years of history in Western civilization. And so much of our culture has the Bible as a reference point. Certainly, you, John, as a humanist, presumably are wanting to push some of that aside because of the baggage that has come with it. But I would suggest that it would be very difficult to argue from an historical point of view that it is not the most influential book in the culture in which we live.
Yes, but it's affecting culture and history the same as providing the basis of a spirituality.
I think this is being very selective, because if you only look at the past 2,000 years and say this is the bit that has value, you forget that the human species has had spirituality for far longer, 50, 75,000 years.
What do you mean by spirituality then?
Well, I think again I'd come back to the idea that some of these big existential questions about meaning in life, who am I, where am I going, destiny, are very important, and they attach those kind of spiritual questions, existential questions, attach to beliefs in the supernatural when people are really hard against it, when they're for example, very understandably afraid of death and the implications of what that means. that they reach out for a spiritual solution or a spiritual answer, and it's very understandable.
Marion, I mean, your situation, you have to deal with that a lot,
Yeah.
I'm sure. Do you find that because within the context of the HIV and AIDS community, the mortality is much more in your face, as it were, that issues of spirituality and the spiritual meaning of life is much more focused?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me it's one of the reasons why I tend not to use the word religion in my HIV and AIDS work, because people don't want to know about something they think is religion, but people are able to identify themselves as spiritual beings. And I think it's maybe the translation from the existential ideas that David's talking about to something that's actually personal and that people can own. Because for me, spirituality is always ultimately about personal relationship.
It sounds very paradoxical, though, doesn't it? Because it's almost as if people from a religious perspective are now very embarrassed to identify themselves with that same religious perspective, and to say no, and is this unfair labeling, unfair branding, or
Yes, we've become an oppressed minority, actually. Having done it to thousands over the years, we've got to suffer it ourselves. Lydia, you wanted to come
I
in.
just wanted to say, is it embarrassment or is it an openness? And saying we want to reach people as the church, so how do we go about doing that? And if you don't like the word religion, then I'll come at you with spirituality, and whatever gets people to spirit. I think the words can get in the way.
Let's take that a wee bit further. Would you see part of your role to be, I'm going to use this word as broad sense, evangelical about what you believe to draw others towards it, or in the same way as perhaps the church might choose to do that?
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
Probably more attraction, not promotion.
But one has to say the evangelical Pentecostalist wing of religion, not only in Christianity but throughout the world, has really been very rampant. It's one part of religion that's really been growing. I think we're talking about 45 million new converts in the past 20 years, just in North and South America alone.
It's the fastest growing bit of the church.
Yes, indeed.
Which, well, what do you think about that? Is that a good thing?
Any growth is good if it means individual lives changed, and I won't be drawn yet into what that change needs to be if I ever knew. But I think that it is this. The wonderful thing is that there is this rather open concept of spirituality, and that it is fashionable at the moment, and I think that can only be a good thing.
But I wonder
that people
whether
can get in touch with what I would say is part of the true self.
I wonder if it's actually that is attracting them, or whether it's the charismatic preachers that tend to actually push forward these Pentecostal
In terms of
something that's
the
more
wing
sort of
of
here
the
and
church
now.
that is growing.
Well, that's what
I
Lydia's
think
talking about. Traction rather than...
Yeah, it's more attractive.
But I think
But the vast majority, particularly of young people, aren't attracted either by the Orthodox Church or by the New Pentecostal Church. They're simply not engaging with the Church. But I do think that many of them are engaging with those old spiritual questions about what's the purpose of our lives, how should we lead our lives. And it's simply that I think, and perhaps this is why you're a bit embarrassed about religion, I think many young people struggle with the ancient belief systems that the religions are based on, and therefore they're more likely to find answers that are meaningful and useful for them. And perhaps by exploring, what should I do with my life, by getting involved with Greenpeace or Amnesty International rather than the local church, because it's moral and social issues that animate young people rather than the belief systems.
Are you embarrassed by it, though?
yeah, I was going to say, I don't think I'm at all embarrassed by it. I think I'm completely pragmatic about the way I choose to use language. I think I would disagree with you that in your suggestion that it's not young people who are joining the evangelical and Pentecostal churches. I think to a large extent it is young people. And I would admit to having some anxiety about that, because I think they're churches often that are preaching a very firm and often quite conservative position. And certainly, as somebody who's worked a lot with people who've been damaged by just those kinds of messages, then I think there's something quite worrying. So, as somebody who spends a lot of her working life with gay men, I know that some of the fastest growing churches are places where those men would not be welcome. And I find that really quite concerning, quite worrying.
Yes, I mean, I agree that young people may be attracted and some numbers are. But the fact remains that the majority of young people in Scotland now do not attend church. Those that do go along with their parents, and the majority of those will stop attending church once they no longer have to go along with their parents. But I do believe if you get a group of young people into a discussion about poverty, about abortion, about nuclear weapons, you'll get very animated discussion. And I think if you engage young people in questions about what's the meaning and purpose of our life, they're interested in, if you like, the old spiritual questions.
But this is exactly what my social studies teacher did when I was about 15 or 16. He would start with the topics, and he didn't bring any spiritual input to it at all, except, you know, maybe after the class was over. So I think in a way, you know, if you have to sort of sell a package through the medium of interesting, controversial topics, then you're actually, in a sense, it is actually false advertising in a way.
That's why I said that
We're going
I
to take a quick break now and join us again in a few minutes.
Andrex. It's so soft and thick. But you can see the difference. It's thick, it's soft, it's Andrex.
Checkmate. Mix Gordons with pleasure.
Yorkie, please, mate.
Yorkie, it's not for girls.
Now anyone can be a digital DJ. With the Intel Pentium 4 processor, the center of your digital world.
Only Venus from Gillette gives you smoothness that makes you feel like a goddess. Each individually sealed refill has soft cushions that surround 3 blades for the closest shave ever in just 1 stroke. So close your skin stays smoother, longer, which all goddesses deserve. Venus, reveal the goddess in you. And now get that lasting smoothness with new Crystal Venus.
It must be great being a film star. All the attention. All that pampering. No wonder they're all so gorgeous. They can afford to look beautiful with all their money. In the meantime, we mere mortals now enjoy even more treatments and treats and pay with our Boots Advantage points. Yep, life's not fair.
Does need something. But wine.
Everything all right, Debs?
Yes, fine. Absolutely fine, thank you. Thank you.
Lee and Perrins with spaghetti bolognese. How did you discover it?
Well done, Deb.
Pasta.
Welcome back. Tonight we're talking about 21st century spirituality. From our discussion so far, it's clear that congregations dropping and young people struggle to find institutionalised religion attractive. So what has taken place in the church in the 21st century? John, you were suggesting that single issue groups and so on are attractive to young people, but will that be enough? Will it give them the meaning they search for, or will that in itself become unsatisfactory in the long run?
Well, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what happens to folk and if the trend towards secularisation continues. I mean, I think what David was perhaps saying earlier on is, what's the difference between a spiritual quest and social studies? And to that extent, I would have to agree that perhaps using the term a sort of secular spirituality is a bit turning it into social studies. And perhaps it's being a bit disingenuous because the idea of spirituality does presume some ideas of the superstitious and the supernatural. If I went to my local humanist group and I said, hey folk, I think we should really develop the spiritual side of our interest in the humanist society, they'd kind of look at me and say, oh, has John got religion? So
religion or drugs are maybe the same thing.
We do have to be careful how we use language, but I suppose I was using that as a working term to say I think folk are interested in exploring the old questions, but because of some of the difficulties of believing the traditional religious dogmas, they perhaps end up going down other avenues.
Lydia.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that living at the Findhorn Foundation, I have an opportunity to meet lots of people from all over the world. And many, many young people come every year to visit with us, to take a course or learn about permaculture or whatever. And I'm often quite astounded by their spiritual maturity, how much exploring they've done, how much questioning they've done, how much meditation practice they've been working on, how much reading they've been doing. Really quite blows me away. For example, at the moment, we've got an eco-village training going on for a month, and there's quite a few young people from all over in this group, and they have quite developed spiritual practice, maybe not members of a religion, but they're heartily seeking on the path.
Would this be what is sometimes called and sometimes pejorative, sometimes not, New Age? You don't like that phrase, do you?
I don't really
I sense it somehow.
Yeah, I don't know. I never quite know. I don't really think about it too much. I guess it's just the age I'm living in is the one I'm working with.
As opposed to the age of Aquarius.
Well, it is the age of Aquarius, actually. That's just an astrological term.
It's interesting in talking about young people and how they're attracted to ideas of mysticism and spirituality because, it really hits them around the time of early adolescence and puberty where they have access to a new dimension in the physical sphere, opens them up to a lot of sort of small crises in their lives, and they then sort of seek after the answers, oftentimes from this transcendental, supernatural, spiritual dimension, and seek to learn about meditation, about other world religions, and to sort of open themselves to everything that perhaps their parents haven't actually told them about the wider world. And one of these things, you use the term superstitions. I mean, one person's superstition is another person's meat, and it's very hard to actually say differentiate between one and the other. And I think that's where New Age kind of blurs this quite a lot because, or whatever is the term for New Age now, is because they are so accepting, the New Age people are so accepting of every point of view that they're very, very hard to sometimes pin down and actually say, well, what do you actually mean? How do you operationally define these terms?
Yeah, what is it I'm going to commit myself to?
That's right.
I also think it's interesting that New Age, most of New Age isn't actually very new.
Yeah.
You wanted to come in.
I think that's just the point I was wanting to make, that I think you're right, David, that young people go off exploring and find what they think is new. And often that already exists within the faith of their birth, be that Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or whatever.
Perhaps it's because their parents gave it to them. Their parents as authority figures, they have to reject that.
Sure. But I think then actually part of their own exploration is to discover the real depth that's in something they've grown up with and that's perhaps familiar and so taken for granted. And I suspect that's one of the reasons that young teenagers leave the churches and then often come back in their early 20s. I think there are other reasons they do that, but I think one of the reasons is that they need to reject what they grew up with and what their parents gave them.
They're very alive to hypocrisy. I think that's
Sure.
They're very almost cynical and skeptical about anything that smacks of hypocrisy, not only in its spiritual, religious spheres, but also in political life as well, and in life in general. And they actually are quite. It's quite exhilarating to actually hang out with youngsters and just hear how challenging they can actually be at times, and challenging of lots of different belief systems.
But do you think they're searching for something to belong to, or to affirm them, or to make a commitment to?
All of those.
Well, yes, and I think it was well said, and I can't remember who said it, that when people stop believing in God, it's not that they don't believe in anything, it's that they'll believe in everything. And I think it's part of that adolescent struggle. And what concerns me about things like the New Age is that it seems to me that adolescence goes on in people's lives for rather too long in terms of their Christianity, in terms of their religion. And I want, because they've rejected Christianity, then we'll go anywhere. And now I want to speak up for God, in a sense, here. I actually believe there is a God. So perhaps in direct opposition to you, John, I believe that there is an outside being force. Now, I don't have any extra knowledge, so don't ask me to define this. But we were talking about the Bible. We need points of reference, and what concerns me is that whatever the point of reference chosen in this postmodern times, we're rejecting points of reference, whether it be the Quran, the Bible, or whatever, and that just seems to me to be foolish, because there's so much there available for us.
You kind of dangerously suggested that Lydia's still in adolescence, I think.
No, but also I'm wondering if what you're saying is because somebody hasn't committed to go back, say, to the church of their youth or of their birth, that they may not believe in God.
No. That's. I want to emphasise the point that it seems to me that if I'm able to say anything, the one thing I can say is God is. So here we are talking about spirituality, all trying to avoid this word God, just in case that brings a different or wrong note into the discussion. But actually, it seems to me that's so fundamental, and that actually the human spiritual search, spirituality, this thing that we have spirituality, whether we like it or not, and actually it's something to do with that search for, as was said earlier, where do I come from? What are my relationships? I mean, all of those things that you so beautifully summed up at the beginning. That, for me, is the spiritual search. The answer, I would say, is God. But what does that mean? I can't tell you what that is. So I have to look at the points of reference, the Bible, and other people's struggles. And I was accused earlier of only 2,000 years. I mean, let's not forget that the Bible is the history from the earliest of times, right through.
I don't really think people have actually rejected the sacred texts of religion. I think they've accepted and have a wider tolerance for lots of different points of view, and they don't make this cut and dried value judgments that this is the Word of God, whereas there are many words of God and many pathways to the same point of origin.
And you see, I think there's a problem that actually, that is what I would agree with John in this discussion. I did agree earlier on that I think adolescence is going on. Adolescence is going on a bit too long, because I think the danger with this very tolerant, open-minded, ecumenical view of all sorts of different spiritual paths is I think there's a danger that we do not properly value things in our education system that we should value, because in our 5th and 6th form, and hopefully in our universities, we teach folk to think, to value thinking critically about information ideas with reference to evidence and scientific inquiry, but also with reference to our history and our history of ideas and so on. And if we just accept, well, anything goes because isn't it great that folk are spiritually curious, I think there's a danger that we are being, at times, with some New Age stuff, just too accepting of nonsense.
So where do we go with the mysterious that's part of all of us? I mean, you talked about the education system there. Where do you go with people and with young people's exploration of the mysterious, for which there may be no answer? I mean, it seems to me that just by what you said, you need to cover all the bases, including the spiritual base. Or are you saying we should teach them that there's no base?
Well,
no spiritual dimension to life?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I think that there is great wisdom sometimes in agnosticism, and as a non-believer, I can appreciate the wonder of the mysterious, that I think is what some folk now call God. So I think folk can still have curiosity in mystery. But there aren't necessarily answers. At the end of the day, there's either belief or skepticism.
But I think you're overestimating the value of the scientific method as one way to find the truth. I think, you know, that's your belief system, but I think there are a lot of other belief systems which, you know, while they won't say, you know, that's all wrong, they'll say, well, there are other systems of belief that are more appropriate to the mystical and the spiritual, other ways. Meditation, for example, which doesn't need religion, but it's certainly not scientific either.
No, I agree. I mean, I think you can explore spiritual ideas and the spiritual side of your personality and interests through drama, through music, through poetry, through love of nature, through literature, but actually you can do that from a secular perspective as well as from a religious perspective.
Lydia, you were trying to come in there.
Yeah, and I just feel sometimes that it gets very closed down, you know, that making a tour through India and doing this and that and then ending up back at your church, that's the appropriate way. And that is what maturity is. But I guess I am just one of those open-minded people that says that what's right for one is not right for the other, and that they're all fine, because if someone is along their path either within the church, moving through and doing all kinds of committed practices, or without, it doesn't mean that they're not both maturing in a spiritual quest, just as someone who's writing poetry or singing is not doing the same thing towards a spiritual life.
Are there no eternal truths in that, though? Is there an eternal truth in there? Is there a one core?
Yeah, well, I think in each person there's an eternal truth that lives that they need to go inside and find, and it may take them outside looking for it.
So are you the end of the journey?
Absolutely not.
So therefore, ask the question again. Or answer the question. I mean, actually, it's something to do with an external. I mean, you see, you're talking about coming back in and finding something, and then going on the journey again. But journeys have destinations.
Well,
don't
maybe
they?
not while I'm still alive. I would hope that my journey toward God would just continue forever. That I would never know the answer, all-encompassing. Because how could I possibly know something that vast?
Which actually you probably agree with. I think I do, yes.
So for me to say, here I am right now sitting with you all, and I know the answer, would be insanity, because only the Great Spirit, God, whatever you want to call it, I choose to call God, knows.
I'm not really wanting to be the devil's advocate, but I have to say
to use another.
I really do have to say that the spiritual quest can sometimes, despite the fact that I know a lot of spiritual people who believe in the supernatural, who do an awful lot of good practical service for the community. Having said that, these quests across India to the Himalayas sound to me very, very self-indulgent and very sort of 21st century, something modern that only people from the West can actually, they only have the sort of capital to be able to do it. And it seems like, this is the sort of culture of
it's almost hormones and a backpack.
Yeah, but that quest can be internal. You could sit in your living room and have the exact same quest.
That's right.
I don't think that it necessarily means self-indulgence.
But it never takes people out with themselves. It doesn't make connections and relationships with the social world sometimes. It can be simply that person thinking about his spiritual needs on his own. And that's the bit that's, that has a sort of downside to it, I think.
Well, I think that everybody's got a journey that's theirs.
But I think, Marion, in particular, relationships are key in the kind of experiences you have within Waverley Care.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's a real danger that we get caught into thinking about the easy bits. So that pick and mix that we were referring to earlier, where actually you take up a practice because you quite like it. But actually, my personal experience is that spiritual journeying is a slog. And that a lot of the time it's pretty hard going, and I'd actually quite prefer not to go there. And I think that that's exactly the experience that the people I walk alongside who are living with HIV have. That most of the time it's pretty grim and it's a bit of a slog, and people actually would like that particular cup to pass them by, and it hasn't. And I think perhaps one of the elements we're missing in this debate is the gift we get from traditional religions of discipline. And that's another of those words we don't like to use and we don't want to admit to. But the discipline of the person who goes to worship every single week, regardless of whether they feel like going. The discipline of the person who says their prayers at night. Lots of my positive people will tell me, I pray for you every night.
But this is about sacrifice, isn't it? Which isn't a word that's often used with spirituality,
Absolutely.
but actually making a sacrifice, a personal sacrifice, that relates in some ways to other people as well.
And I think it's exactly that. It's about relationship. Because if our spiritual journey is about anything, it's about moving further into that relationship with God that John and Lydia were both describing. And is that, some of that for me, is actually about building relationship within the community. So the language I would use is that we meet the Christ in the people we meet.
Sure.
Yes, I just think it would be foolish to go on a journey if you had the opportunity of a companion, to go without a companion. To go on a journey if you had the opportunity of a map, to go without the map.
Well, we're going to continue our journey in just a moment, but we've come to end of part 2. Join us again after the break.
Bananas. £2 a pound. £2 a pound. Can't get better than that.
Hello, lovey. How you doing, handsome?
£50 a pound. You ain't big upstanding. Giving these away. Absolutely giving these away.
New Jacobs Thai Bites. Authentic Thai with a British accent.
New Visibly Refined Moisturiser from Neutrogena. For smoother, finer, more beautiful skin, even without makeup. New Visibly Refined, the confidence of naked skin.
You want some, fly boy?
Well, I was looking for something crispy, actually.
I am all crispy and I'm creamy inside. I've got chocolate. Oh. You can lick my nipples. Bite me, bite me, bite me, bite me, bite me, bite me. Bueno soft and creamy, bueno crispy and light. I'll be whatever you want me to be.
Come on, John. Come on, son.
You don't often see generosity like that.
At Iceland you do! These Birds Eye 12 original burgers, buy one, get one free! Or these Chicago Town snack pizzas, buy one, get one free! Or this 2-litre bottle of Fanta Orange, buy one, get one free! Or these 4 Iceland fresh chicken fillets, only $2.99! Ha ha! Are we doing a deal or are we doing a deal?
When you've got a big day ahead, the last thing you need is constipation. All bloated and sluggish. Like a lot of people, I take Senokot. It's made from natural senna. Just one dose at night works in harmony with your body for gentle, predictable relief when you wake. Ready? You bet. Go on, enjoy your day.
Senokot, natural relief for a brighter tomorrow.
Wow. Oh, darling, this is amazing. Hey, do you know we can go whale and dolphin?
Specsavers Reactions lenses react to light. They usually cost £49, but now they're free of charge if you buy glasses from our £75 range or above.
Darling, what are you doing?
Good company, cool pint of Miller, beer nuts. Life doesn't get any better than this.
Now, women's beach volleyball.
You were saying, Frank? Good company, cool pint of Miller, beer nuts. Life doesn't get any better than this.
Welcome welcome back to the final part of tonight's discussion on 21st century spirituality. Spirituality can be something you do on your own as an individual, or something that happens in a group collectively, church or otherwise. Perhaps the Findhorn Foundation would be one of the otherwises. Do you find, amongst all the people you were talking about earlier, a desire still for worship in some form or other?
Yes, I do. In many ways, we have worship at the Findhorn Foundation. Sunday mornings, we have singing and dances of universal peace, which come from many different traditions. Each morning, we have several meditation practices, and in the evenings, every single day.
Communal thing?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep. So people may do practice on their own, but they can do communal practice as well. And you were talking about discipline before the break, and we had a meeting with Eileen Caddy, who's one of the founders of the Findhorn Foundation. She's in her 80s, and people came to ask her some questions the other morning, and one was about this discipline of spiritual practice, and the balance of what feels right to be doing, and what's necessary for growth and for real connection with spirit. And what she said I thought was helpful. It was, what feels right, you'll know in your heart, but that sometimes, yes, it's a slog, as Miriam was saying.
I mean, she's a very disciplined person. I've seen her talk.
Absolutely.
And, you know, for somebody who's got a kind of all comers come type kind of view in one way, she's highly disciplined in her way of being.
6:30 a.m. every day for an hour.
Yes,
so
amazing.
all we can do, though, all I can do is look at her as an example and say, okay, how can I do it? What discipline do I need in my life toward my path? And to answer your question about worship, I would say we all worship in different ways, but most do worship and do feel the need for it.
Marion, the institutional church is looking for other ways to be more attractive in its worship, not to perhaps mimic what happens at Findhorn, but when we hear things like, for example, Church of Scotland announced it was going to revamp the Lord's Prayer. Had me back. But I mean, what would you say your views of worship in the institutional sense should be?
Yeah, well, within the parish where I'm attached, we've looked very much to offer some alternative forms of worship. So we have a very traditional Sunday morning main service, and that's much as you would expect in an Episcopalian church. But we then have a whole range of alternatives that we offer on Sunday evenings. Mostly, probably, services which would be much more familiar to Lydia. So we use lots of candles, we use a lot of silence, we quite often use symbols like pebbles and water and flowers and sand and those kinds of things. And I think that there's a big challenge to the church, actually, to speak to people much more where they are, to challenge people in different ways.
So there are so many of these gimmicks that are so physical. It's almost as if you're taking tangible objects, art objects, pretty techniques, rituals, and you're actually trying to make the intangible more tangible to people who want to go that way.
Well, are they that, or are they aids?
Aids, right?
Because I think that one of the difficulties, certainly for young people with some of the very traditional church worship, is it's fairly fixed, it has a clear format, and that for some people is wonderful, and they find a freedom within that format and that liturgical setting. But I think the reality is we live in a culture that actually operates differently from that. And I think that to bring in and to actually appreciate something broader seems to me to not be a bad thing, as so long as it's constantly pointing back to...
I think the culture we live in is very iconoclastic and very skeptical, and what the people from the spiritual dimension are bringing into it is they're bringing in an awful lot of iconography into it. A lot of these symbols and images, you spoke about candles, I mean, belief in miracles, all kinds of, as you said, aids to attract people. Now, you know, I know that as a believer, you believe that these things are all possible, but I mean, it's quite peculiar that in a society that has grown very cynical and very skeptical, the people from the supernatural dimension are wanting to make their own belief system more attractive in a very physical way.
Well, maybe we're just trying to re-grasp the understanding of symbolism as a way of speaking about the things that cannot
As an art
describe. Absolutely. John, you were trying to come in there.
I'm not sure if this is if the crisis for the church, if you like, is about packaging or product, because a bit of this is about packaging. And yeah, okay, some young folk may not go to church because it's not cool enough, or just they're not interested, or that their friends don't, that's not the thing to do any longer. But certainly from my experience, for example, of taking secular funerals, when I meet with a family beforehand, I generally check out, why are you wanting a secular funeral? And they'll say, oh, Dad wasn't very religious. But they'll seldom say, well, Dad didn't go to church because it wasn't happy-clappy enough, or because the pews were too hard, or because there weren't enough candles. They'll say, he thought it was a lot of old nonsense. The problem is actually people's understanding of the belief system and how that can make sense to them in the 21st century, given that many people will still see the traditional belief system as something that comes out of people's superstitious ideas pre-Darwin, pre-Big Bang, 1,500, 2,000 years ago. So it's not my problem, if you like, because I'm secular, but if you wanted a bit of advice from me, I would say, look at modernising the product, not just the packaging. It's about how do you make these beliefs sensible to people in the current day and age.
John, Bible Society, how do you make the beliefs more, well, sensible is an interesting word, but sensible in the 21st century?
Yes. I'm all, and I speak personally here, for abandoning a bit of all the religious bits and getting back to the core. Easily said, not easily done. So what is the core? Well, I would say that, one of the central, or the central character within the Bible is the person of Jesus, who claimed to show us the way to God. Now, I think there is enough evidence for me as a human being to say enough people have taken that claim up and found it to be true. So therefore, there's a lot to be said for going back into the Bible as the story book, if you like, and recapturing some of the words, the spirit, testing the spirit of those words, what it is actually mean, and how will that affect our lives now, both corporately and individually. So actually, it is back to the text, really, that I'm
It's interesting, perhaps one of the most apparently successful methods that this has been done in recent times has been through things called the Alpha course. I don't know if you've come across that, but that seems to involve small groups of people having a meal together, relaxing, chilling out, and then having an exploration of these quite fundamental issues. Would you see that as a good model? Or?
I think it's no, I wouldn't say it's a good model, but it's not the best model. My concern there is that it's quite prescriptive. In other words, it's an explanation of the scriptures rather than exploration. And I would look for an exploration, not in any sort of mishmash way where anything goes, but actually in perhaps even literary criticism terms. What did the author mean here? What might have been meant by that? What was the context in which this was said? So there's a real exploration, which then allows gay men to accede to religion. Now, I'm not saying anything, please. I'm not saying all bishops, gay men can be bishops, bishops can be gay men. It doesn't matter to me in this context. What I'm saying is that everybody has a right to this. And it seems to me that as you explore the early offerings, and that's right from Old Testament through to New Testament, we just see constantly of God's loving care for his world, back to this. Did I ever say external God? I hope I didn't.
You did, yes.
Because I don't actually believe that. God is amongst us now. God is very much part of who and what we are, both individually and corporately. So just trying to get into that essential of life, as far as I'm concerned, and just using the people who've shown the way. Mother Teresa of Calcutta is a modern example. There are others, Bishop Tutu, Archbishop Tutu. There are people who are people who are showing a route.
But as a layman, I would ask, is this, back to the basic tenets? If you take that approach as the way forward, do you actually then need the church to do that? Do you need a church?
Probably
an
not.
organization?
I think you need. There's individual lunacy comes in rather too often, and one of the ways of avoiding individual lunacy is to get together with a group of people where you rub up against each other, and where the more lunatic ideas are made more come into a corporate...
members of my congregation rubbing up against each other. It just strikes me as...
Intellectually speaking.
But, I mean, there are wider ramifications for this particular road you're going down here. What we're saying is that the issue is spirituality. We don't need the organisation.
It's dangerous. I agree. It's dangerous. You know, you might find that if you go this route, you come up with all sorts of crazy ideas, like we shouldn't zap the Iranians or the Iraqis or whatever. You know, there may be all sorts of humanist ideas that come forth that we don't at the moment agree on. Well, that's part of the deal, it seems to me.
I think one of the things that's getting thrown away in the church organization with this view is all the sort of levels of authority, the authoritarian. It sounds a very anti-authoritarian, you know, almost doing away with the role of the Pope, the bishops, the archbishops, the cardinals, the priests, and making it, you know, just all equals on the same level.
There's some attraction for you?
Oh, absolutely. I'll sign on this.
That's right. Yeah, we've got convert one.
Yeah. I think what we are missing, though, is that actually church isn't just about a discussion group. Church is about worship in community, for me. Mm-hmm. And it's about care in community, and it's about pastoral care and support.
Living the life.
And whether that's defined by a particular building and a congregation that people belong to and define themselves as belonging to because it meets in a particular place, or whether it's a group of people like my people who are HIV positive, who in effect are a self-defining community, then actually I think people form pastoral associations and people actually take care of one another spiritually as well as physically.
What about the Human Society then? I mean, you don't have worship as such, do you? But the belonging is important to people.
I think it is, but I again think you can get that through many other sources in life, not just churches or humanist societies. It may be through political affiliations or just other groups you belong to. Everyone needs to belong to something. I mean, just picking up on what John was saying earlier, I mean, it seems to me if you go back to the book, as it were, I mean, much of what you're saying I can agree with, but I can agree with it from a purely secular perspective. I can appreciate 2,000 years of Christian moral teaching and say, hey, there's something in that for humanism.
But that's the beauty of my position, you see, that I've got what you've got and more, I say. And the truth is, you know, my mother is a humanist. Yeah. When she dies, she wants masses of flowers and lots of Mozart. Now, that is her expression, and I think actually there's something about expression. Mm-hmm. But what will I need when my mother dies? I will need more than masses of flowers and Mozart. Lots of money spent on flowers, isn't that a bit of a waste of money? My social conscience would rather that a good donation went. No. What does she want? What do I want? Well, I will actually need some sort of expression that I can give to celebrate that life which gave me life.
This idea of spirituality as expression is a quite interesting one, because I think I was being a wee bit disingenuous when I use the phrase devil's disciple or devil's advocate, because, I mean, in terms of the supernatural and supernatural beliefs, I mean, in this very accepting, tolerant view that we've come to now, what about people who believe in witchcraft, for instance? I mean, they have a belief in the supernatural, and there's a kind of a spiritual dimension in there as well, because they're certainly not talking about the physical dimension. Are they allowed into this broader?
Well, one question might be, if we did go down that road, would there be any future for the church? I mean, do you think there is any future for the church, David?
No, I don't really think there is. I think in the short term, yes, over the next several hundred years, perhaps, but I think, you know, I'm looking at it from
that's an interesting view. Depends what you mean by short term.
I'm looking at it from an evolutionary point of view, and I think that eventually the human race will outgrow it. But I think that will have to do a lot with science and technology taking on a more and more important element. I think, you know, this quote from Richard Dawkins, where he said, you know, the selfish gene chap, where he says that he reckons that the human brain is almost engineered not to understand evolution. I think it's also very well programmed to understand the spiritual and the supernatural. It's almost overly determined. There almost seems to be a very pressing, urgent need to have spirituality in our lives. And people feel deprived when you take that away from them. Whatever the orientation is.
What about you, Marion? The church, no future, just part of evolution?
Of course, I'm going to say there's a future for the church in some shape or form.
Not just because of your pension scheme.
And I don't think it's just because I want my pension. Whether there's a future for the church in its current buildings and its current formats over the next 300 or 400 years, who knows? Thankfully, I won't be here to see that. But I don't think people will stop yearning for that relationship with God.
And God is the future. That's the thing. So church buildings, hierarchical structures, these things can go because God is.
So faith will be there somehow.
People will always want that community and that yearning to come together in that communal search. So, yeah.
Before we run out of time, I'd like to thank my guests and you at home for watching. Next week on Faith Without Walls, the subject for discussion is ritual. The question will be, I suppose, is not only what sort of organisation will be there, but who will be in charge of it? Will it be the kind of more egalitarian thing? Or will it be
you need to put somebody in charge?
Well, I'm asking the question.
Perhaps we don't need anybody in charge.
Do we just need a bunch of individuals? But how will you perpetuate faith without common experiences?
But then you don't. A common experience doesn't need a leader. It needs
sharing.
Experience. It needs sharing. Exactly. The experience needs to be
probably too much of a Presbyterian thing. Not leader. It's organisation.
It needs a direction, doesn't it? Because the reality is we're not all going to become conservative and evangelical.
New Milky Bar Munchies are made for adults. But try telling that to kids. New Milky Bar Munchies for adults.
Partied out, stressed out, worn out? One day it'll show on your face. Say stop. New Garnier Synergy Stop, our first multi-action daily moisturiser with multivitamins A, C and E. Say stop to the appearance of fine lines, stop to dull complexion, stop to UVB rays. Proven by dermatologists and by me. New Garnier Synergy Stop. Make time wait.
Fed up with streaky self-tans? Try new Garnier Ombre Solaire No Streaks Bronzer. It sprays at any angle, even on the back of your legs and on your back, for an all-over natural-looking tan with no telltale marks. New Garnier Ombre Solaire No Streaks Bronzer.
It's the new boss. She's here.
Do you think she'll be able to tell the difference? Well, I reckon the instant coffee tastes the same as the ground. Right, next item, office decoration.
See you later.
Go.
All right, Rosie.
Have you got any golden wonder? I've got money and everything.
Who sent you?
Floyd.
All right. What do you want?
2 cheese and onion, a salt and vinegar, and a pack of prawn cocktail.
Wait here.
It was easy, really. You got no to handle yourself.
Got any golden wonder, mate?
A major ride.
Enjoy more small talk for less with the new pay-as-you-go home phone service from the Post Office. You can save up to 50% on all national calls, and you don't have to leave BT. To start saving, call free now on 0808 182 2222 or pop into your nearest branch. The Post Office. What a good idea.
No, just bananas.
If he can find the back of the net with this shot, the cup is there. What must be going through that young
Do you have what it takes to be a foster carer? If you care, call 020 7972 3900 and find out more about fostering.
Simon, it's 2 o'clock tonight, but right now more topical discussion as we ask the ultimate questions.
Yoko Ono recently paid £150,000 for a huge billboard in Piccadilly Circus in London. On it, lines from the song Imagine, John Lennon's anthem to peace. Yoko says that after September the 11th, she's done it to cheer people up. But in a world where conflict currently dominates the news, is this sort of sentiment just a pipe dream? Does peace have a chance? Tonight's ultimate question. Hello and welcome to Ultimate Questions. Tonight we're looking at another of those key moral, ethical and spiritual issues few of us can ignore. On our panel, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, author, broadcaster and journalist, a Muslim who says she's not a pacifist, as sometimes war may be the only way to get justice. Terry Waite, the former Archbishop's envoy, was on a peace mission to the Middle East when he was kidnapped and held captive for 5 years. Rabbi Julia Neuberger, one of the first and certainly most prominent women rabbis. She says there is such a thing as a just war, otherwise dictators like Hitler would go unchallenged. And Martin Bell, the former anti-Sleaze MP, who as a television reporter covered no fewer than 11 wars and was shot while reporting from the front line. Our panel, together with our invited audience, drawn from around the country and representing a cross-section of views and beliefs, all here to help us discuss the question, does peace have a chance? Martin, as a war correspondent, you were right there up in the front line. Do you think that given human nature, peace will ever have a chance?
It's a hard thing to say, but I think aggression is in the heart and spirit of man, and come to that to a lesser degree of woman. We are an aggressive animal. I suppose the human being at its worst, like the fox and the weasel, takes pleasure in killing its own species, and there are not many species you can say that of. But I think what we surely have to do, since we have industrialized the science of killing people, and we can do it on an enormous scale, is to pay more attention to preempting conflict when we can, moderating it, just stopping it happen, and not letting the worst in the human species take over, and paying some attention at last to the Geneva Conventions, which in the last wars I reported might as well not have been written.
But given human nature, we will never get to the point where we will eradicate war.
We never have yet, and it will be wonderful if we could, but I think to be realistic, we have to get a hold of our own worst instincts and deal with it like that.
And Yasmin, obviously, after September the 11th, there's been a great deal written about Islam and about war. Do the words, "give peace a chance," John Lennon's famous words, do they ring a bell with Muslims?
I can't speak for other Muslims, and I don't think I should, but it certainly rings a bell with me. I think not only do I believe peace does have a chance, I think it is quite remarkable how much peace we have managed to achieve some of the time. We're in a particularly depressing period now, but we mustn't forget that Europe was a mess for hundreds of years. And I mean, the Bosnian War was a real blot on that landscape, because for a long time these warring nations did manage to make something else happen. And many other countries similarly have made progress of sorts that we might never have dreamt of. Many Muslims like me feel we have to believe that we are going to be able to live in peace with other people. But whether we'll succeed in pushing that vision, I don't know.
Right, so progress in containing war, but never probably able to completely contain it and eradicate it.
Ideals are important.
And Julia, what we're seeing right now in Palestine and Israel, all this tit-for-tat retaliation, how does a community extricate itself from that cycle of violence, where one piece of violence begets another?
I think the only thing you can do is recognise that to give peace a chance requires immense human courage. It doesn't require all that much courage to go on with a cycle of violence if that's the way, if you like, you've been brought up or circumstances prevailing encourage you that way.
It takes courage to risk your life.
It takes courage to risk your life, and it may well take courage to go and face, you know, the others on the front line. I'm not suggesting that those who go to fight are not brave, but it takes real courage as a politician to pull back from a spiral of violence and to make the first move, and often, as you know, to make the people who want to carry on very angry indeed.
And do you think that peace is actually achievable in the Middle East, given the track record?
I do think peace is achievable in the Middle East. If I didn't think it was achievable, I would feel that all the ideals for which I and many other people stand would be absolutely as nothing. But it requires huge human endeavour.
And is that a realistic belief, given that that human endeavour, great though it is, has never been adequate?
It's never been adequate thus far, but there have been moments where we've seen great signs that peace might break out, and I've also, in my relatively recent lifetime, seen a great change of heart in Northern Ireland, where I think a lot of us thought that any kind of peace was very unlikely. So I think you can see human beings working hard for peace, and that's what I think we have to do.
Well, we have in the audience with us Bruce Kent, who headed up the campaign for nuclear disarmament and is a well-known pacifist. Bruce, do you ever feel that you are fighting a hopeless cause?
On the contrary, I think it's a very positive cause. It's actually doing quite well. I think peace is the norm for most people here. They live